What makes some forms of leadership last longer than others? Why do certain rulers earn loyalty while others face constant unrest? And how can balance and moderation protect the community from decline? Hello, friends, and welcome back to the part 14 of Aristotle's Politics. Today we are finishing book 5. I think this part is both weird and interesting because there are so many similarities to Machiavelli. Here we are basically talking about monarchies and tyrannies, two opposite regimes in Aristotelian theory of politics, how they come about, how they are different, and how they are preserved. If you enjoy these episodes, make sure to like and subscribe on YouTube or follow and leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You can find this show on all major platforms. For daily content, you can follow me on Instagram at philosophy.everyday. And if you've missed the earlier episodes, check them out as they all connect together. Alongside these solo episodes, I've got guest conversations coming up too. I've had one recently with Roman Yampolsky on AI and simulation theory, with Massimo Pigliucci on Stoicism, Stephen Hicks on enlightenment, and very recently, Spencer Greenberg on rationality and decision making. Check them out if you're interested. Now back to Aristotle. Previously, we have spoken about democracies, oligarchies, polities, and aristocracies. Here, today, now we finally turn to the last form of rule Aristotle analyzes: the monarchy and its opposite, which is tyranny. We are specifically talking about what happens in monarchies, what causes their preservation, and what leads to their destruction. According to Aristotle, monarchy is the best form of rule, at least in theory, while tyranny is the worst. Between these two extremes, we find all the other systems arranged in order of preference. First monarchy, then aristocracy, then polity, democracy, oligarchy, and tyranny. So what separates the best from the worst? Aristotle says that this is simple: purpose and the end goal of the rule. A king usually rules for the common good. A tyrant rules for their own benefit, pleasure, or wealth. So a monarchy is the rule of one for the benefit of all. A tyranny is the rule of one for the benefit of one. Aristotle says that monarchies and tyrannies rise and fall for the same general reasons as every other system: conflict, resentment, and imbalance, and all the other human emotions that are associated with it. Yet each has its own internal logic. Monarchy is closer in its symbolism and spirit to aristocracy, but the tyranny carries the worst traits of both oligarchy and democracy, which are already unstable regimes in Aristotelian understanding. Aristotle says that the first difference between monarchy and tyranny is in how rulers are chosen and how they view their purpose. Aristotle says that kings are chosen from among the most exceptional citizens. By the way, this is just hypothetical scenario when I say chosen. Chosen here indicates general understanding that they are the best, because most of the time, actually the process is hereditary. So whoever stands out in virtue and wisdom naturally becomes fit to lead in this understanding. We are talking about someone who is in steroids in terms of virtue and wisdom. It is very similar to Plato's understanding of philosopher king. Here, the king's rule is to maintain order, secure justice, and protect virtuous citizens from harm. So kingship is based on merit. One person governs because they are the best suited for the task. Their sense of fairness, moderation, and care for others sets them apart from everyone in the society. Tyrants, on the other hand, Aristotle says that usually emerge from among the people. They rise by feeding on the crowd's resentment towards the notable, the competent, the rich, and the successful people. At first, they are popular among the people because they flatter, they condemn the elite, they claim to fight for the common man, but soon they reveal a different nature. They replace those they criticize and rule entirely for themselves. Aristotle says that this pattern is visible throughout history. Most tyrants, he says, started as populist figures who were admired because they attacked those already in power. There are, however, many ways tyranny can begin, and it's not always one-way road. Sometimes kings themselves grow corrupt and start ruling like masters instead of guardians. Sometimes people elect a ruler and grant them too much power until they refuse to give it back. Sometimes oligarchies collapse inwardly when the richest citizen consolidates all control in their hands. So there are multiple ways, Aristotle says, tyranny can emerge, and there is no single road to it. And not every tyranny is the same in how it gets established and how it operates. The second difference, Aristotle says, between monarchy and tyranny is in how each relates to the people. A king acts as a kind of guardian. He protects the property of citizens, ensures justice, and restrains excesses on all sides, and avoids extreme behavior. For tyrant, however, there is no such boundary. They use power for their personal enjoyment, and they treat the city as resources as their own. They treat the city's resources as their own. Even when tyrant seems to act for the public good, it is usually for their own private advantage. So he summarizes with these two concepts of honor and material goods. So in kingship, honor is the main pursuit of the ruler. In tyranny, the aim is material pleasure, abundance of material goods for themselves. The third difference lies in how they secure themselves. Aristotle says that kings place their trust in their own people. Citizens, in turn, respect the king enough to defend him. But tyrants do not trust their people. They live in suspicion. When a tyrant faces a threat or there is a, let's say, war, they often hire foreign guards or mercenaries. Why? Because they fear that if a war breaks out, their own citizens might turn against them instead of fighting for them. Aristotle calls tyranny a kind of hybrid, part oligarchy and part democracy. From oligarchy, it inherits greed, suspicion, and an obsession with the private wealth. From democracy, it inherits hostility towards anyone remarkable. Those with skill, virtue, or distinction become threats. Depending on the situation, tyrants may switch masks. They flatter the rich or the poor as needed, pretending to care for them, while in reality they care for no one. Aristotle says that monarchies and tyrannies, like all other systems, collapse because of injustice, fear, and contempt. These emotions are powerful, and Aristotle says that even small personal fights, personal emotions can ignite them. He gives an example from Cyprus, where the ruler Eogoras lost power because his son had taken the wife of another prominent nobleman. People sometimes get emotional from jealousy or wounded pride or ego. Also, important to point out here that this is also a point where Aristotle departs strongly from his teacher Plato and Plato's teacher Socrates, that famous philosopher. Socrates would say such passions arise from ignorance of the true good, something that could be cured by philosophy. Aristotle would say that this is simply political life, reality of the life. You cannot wish human emotions away, you must understand and manage them. That would be Aristotle's position against Socrates slash Plato. Funnily enough, Aristotle even talks about an anecdote where the poet Euripides was mocked for his bad breath, and that the petty insult spiraled into a series of feuds and revolts in uh, Mytilene. Aristotle says that the competent generals often turn against their monarchs uh, when they feel disrespected or neglected. This is especially true when rulers live in luxury while their commanders suffer in war. Let's take a pause here because if we zoom back a bit from this discussion, and go to the history, we can see this pattern clearly. During the later centuries of the Arab Caliphate, the rulers hired foreign troops or foreign generals, mostly competent Turkish or Persian generals, to protect themselves, to protect the caliphate, protect the empire. Over time, those soldiers, those commanders demanded real power, and the caliph remained only as a symbolic figure in the next centuries. The same happened in the Roman Empire of the 3rd century, when mercenaries gained so much influence that they could install or remove emperors at will. At some point, the office of emperor became like a bribe to be sold to anyone who could offer the price. And later, in the Ottoman Empire, the Janissaries, which was originally intended to be a slave army, eventually became powerful enough to challenge the Sultan himself with various revolts. And it took until 19th century for Sultan to actually defeat them and abolish this office altogether, abolish this institution altogether. So the lesson here Aristotle says, of course, Aristotle doesn't talk about Ottoman Empire, Roman Empire, because these events happened much later. This is just my reflection. But he says that, so overall, when someone begins to feel smarter or more capable than their superiors, respect fades. Basically, this is just human nature in practice in social relations that happens everywhere. You would lose your respect for your boss, for example, if you're working under the boss and you feel that you're superior than them, and you would slowly start disobeying the rules, regulations, making your own decisions in independence. So the same logic here, same social relations also apply here. And if you scale it to the societal level, that's what ends up happening. Aristotle says, in connection to that idea that there will always be some people bold enough and courageous enough to seize an opportunity when they see weaknesses such as these. They might do it for different reasons, sharing power, becoming rich, or just to make a name for themselves. And we should also keep in mind that Aristotle is speaking about a pre-modern world here. Yes, these ideas are universal. Societal relations, human DNA hasn't changed in 2000 years. Still, same issues happen. Uh, but for example, if you're talking about the pre-modern world, let's say if you were an ambitious young man in ancient times, there were rarely times where there were peaceful paths to fame. You couldn't go and become a founder of startup, for example, in Silicon Valley. So you had to start some kind of trouble to prove your strength or to gain social status. So if you're a young commander in Roman Empire and you see this emperor that lives in luxury but doesn't contribute to anything and you are suffering in the war, you start losing respect for the emperor, and then bad things start happening. So that's basically the idea that Aristotle is pointing out here. Aristotle says that tyrannies also fall when divisions appear inside the ruling elite, internal divisions, internal conflicts. There is also the natural hatred that accumulates around tyranny naturally. So the more a tyrant indulges in private pleasures and displays their wealth, the more they awaken the resentment among those beneath them. People begin to envy and get jealous, basically. Okay, Aristotle talked a lot about tyranny, but what about the better form of one-man rule, which is monarchy, according to Aristotle, at least in theory? Aristotle says that monarchies are not destroyed by outside forces, because since they are so good, they cannot be really destroyed by outside forces, but he says that they are destroyed by internal decay. There are two main causes. When those who share in royal power begin fighting among themselves, and when kings start acting like tyrants instead of maintaining their virtue. Then Aristotle becomes nostalgic and says that true monarchies, as he imagines them in his theory, no longer exist, even though he thinks monarchy is still the best regime in paper, rule of one supreme individual, supremely virtuous individual. He says that by his time, the world has changed, populations had grown, education became widespread, and life had become too complex for one man of perfect virtue to rule everything. by himself. It's funny because he seems very almost nostalgic here, uh, longing for the age of legendary kings who ruled with wisdom and restraint. Here's where I have a criticism of Aristotle's idea here. He begins this chapter making a sharp distinction between monarchy and tyranny, but when it comes to their downfall, he mostly speaks about tyranny. He never really explains how a good monarchy ruled by a decent and wise person might decline. It feels like he avoids that question altogether. His conclusion that good monarchies no longer exist sound less like a coherent argument and more like old man complaining about his time. I don't know, maybe he was just quietly criticizing his past student, Alexander the Great. Remember that he was the tutor of Alexander the Great when Alexander was young. Maybe he got dissatisfied with his rule after Alexander became so much powerful that now he's criticizing his time through these texts. We don't really know. So that's all about chapter 10. Now that Aristotle has explained how monarchies and tyrannies are destroyed, he turns to the next question: how are they preserved? How can they be preserved? Aristotle says that the answer is almost a mirror opposite of the causes of their destruction. If corruption comes from excess and arrogance, preservation comes from moderation and restraint. Aristotle says that the monarchy lasts longer when it becomes more moderate, when the ruler avoids extremes and behaves in a way that does not provoke any envy or resentment. Aristotle argues that in general, the less power a king exercises directly, the longer his regime endures. If a ruler limits their authority, if they don't act like a master but carry themselves with the dignity of an equal among citizens, people will not see them as a threat. So he goes back to giving again empirical examples from the history from his times. He uses Sparta as a main example here. Sparta was not really absolutely strict monarchy for its times. Yes, we remember Sparta very disciplined, very militaristic society where order was a main thing that mattered. But actually, in reality, it wasn't that strict in terms of how it was governed. Spartan kings, he says, managed to preserve their office for generations because they never claimed absolute power. For example, Spartan kings themselves established the office of overseers, the ephors, who acted as a counterbalance to the authority of the king. This check on power, Aristotle says, instead of weakening the kings, made their positions more stable and respected over time. Here, Aristotle even shares a funny anecdote again. When King Theopompus of Sparta created the office of overseers, the ephors, his wife asked him, "Are you not ashamed to hand over to your son a kingship that is weaker than the one you received?" To which he replied, "Not at all. I'm handing over a kingship that will last longer." So that's the main idea. By limiting their own power, Spartan kings actually preserved their rule over generations. And we all know, I think I spoke about this in the earlier episodes, where how Spartans lived, dining together, living together in barracks, armies. So there was no reason for resentment basically among the society for the kings, against the kings. After that funny anecdote and example from Sparta, Aristotle shifts his focus rather surprisingly and goes hardcore Machiavellian and begins to explain how tyrannies can also be preserved. When you read it, it actually sounds like a practical guide on how to stay in power. It's a bit darker, but I'm going to summarize them regardless. Do not try at home. Okay, here are the trips according to Aristotle's idea. First, Aristotle says eliminate those with higher ambitions and independent thought. And best way to stay safe is to remove these people early. Second, he says, do not allow clubs, gatherings, or schools where people can meet, talk, and think. especially the educated or those with leisure time. Aristotle specifically emphasizes the danger of leisure itself, leisure time, having some time to think. So this should be abolished. This should not be allowed. Third, Aristotle says that to make sure that population remains ignorant and overworked. If people are constantly occupied with survival, they won't have time to think and organize. Aristotle even points out ancient Egypt as an example, and specifically the building of pyramids, where rulers kept their people busy by assigning massive works, such as the construction of pyramids. So it took decades, and no one really had time to do anything else. The workers that were building these massive structures. I guess the darker side here that Aristotle doesn't mention is that rulers in Egypt also appealed to religion. Yeah, they said we are building these structures for some higher power that ordinary people cannot recognize. So that's why it's important. The national project of building pyramids. Fourth, Aristotle says that nothing should escape the tyrant's notice. Tyrant must have reliable spies and loyal informants everywhere so that nothing escapes their eyes. Fifth, Aristotle says that tyrant should encourage division among the people, like quietly fueling conflicts and conspiracies. Friends should be turned against each other. The poor should envy the rich. The rich should despise the poor. Basically, early blueprint for divide and rule kind of philosophy. So that's about the practical guidelines about how tyrannies can be preserved according to Aristotle. Sounds darker. It's like you're reading a Machiavelli, but that's basically about it. Here, Aristotle is not really trying to moralize. He's just pointing out, if we are objectively speaking, objectively evaluating, he's just pointing out the empirical realities, like how they can be preserved, how can they survive, and what happens usually in history. So he's not saying that you should do these as a ruler, but he's saying this is how they can be preserved. This is how what happens in reality. Then Aristotle says that tyranny is in some sense an extreme form of democracy. It is actually a bit strange observation that seems contradictory at first. Aristotle says that in tyranny, flattery replaces genuine respect. Tyrant seeks the love of the masses through sweet words and praises. So people are praised and entertained, but never truly respected. But here I have my own criticism because Aristotle's argument seems a bit inconsistent. Because at first he describes tyrants as deeply fearful of their own people, and then he lists all those practical guides on how to manage it. So fearful that during the wars they would avoid using citizen armies and instead hire foreign soldiers. And that's why he initially said that tyranny resembles oligarchy in some respect. But then in this chapter, he claims tyranny is kind of democracy in steroids. It is not entirely clear how both can be true at the same time. Because a ruler who fears his citizens cannot also trust them as a democratic base. It seems a bit contradictory, this claim of tyranny being the extreme form of democracy. Okay, but despite that, Aristotle again gives a clear summary of what tyrants ultimately aim for. First, he says people should have small minds, modest thoughts, and no grand ambitions. Second, citizens should distrust one another. Third, people should lack leisure and competence to do something meaningful. So he says this is what tyrants usually aim for. 3 goals and 3 aims. Aristotle also adds additional context here by claiming that a tyrant must appear like a king. He does not have to be so virtuous, but he should appear as virtuous, and that is enough. Again, very similar lines to Machiavelli here. And that's why I told you earlier that reading this part of the book is like reading Machiavelli. He says that tyrants should present themselves as something noble, orderly, and even moral. So in summary, Aristotle advises that a tyrant should imitate a monarch, imitate a king in appearance and behavior, at least outwardly. Tyrants should also appear religious, or at least respectful of the gods. Because if citizens believe that the ruler is God fearing, they assume that gods themselves protect that guy. And also, tyrants should distribute honors and rewards to competent people sometimes to keep them loyal. But punishments, interestingly enough, should always be carried out by others. He says. He says tyrants should be seen as a source of mercy, but never the source of cruelty. Aristotle says that tyrants should also avoid making any single person too powerful, especially bold or ambitious types. And above all, the tyrant must avoid arrogance. Simple gestures of respect and modesty towards ordinary people or powerful people can prevent resentment from taking root. Aristotle ends this part in a curious note. He says that tyranny can last longer if they imitate monarchies, if they learn moderation and act with some dignity. He concludes that if a tyrant behaves in this almost managerial way, he may not become a good man, he may not become a virtuous person, but he will become a less destructive one. The people too may benefit. The people may live better under a such regime than under a reckless ruler, a reckless tyrant. So, paradoxically, Aristotle ends by suggesting that the path to preserving tyranny is to make it look less like tyranny. And then we move on to the final chapter of Book 5, where Aristotle concludes Book 5 by saying that some regimes, by their very nature, are short lived. He says that in general, oligarchies and tyrannies are always short lived because both are built on instability and resentment. Aristotle says that in oligarchies, the few rule for their own gain, and the excluded many always wait for a chance to strike back. In tyrannies, one person dominates everyone else, and that imbalance cannot hold long, Aristotle says. Then Aristotle again goes back to history, empirical examples, and acknowledges that there are few rare exceptions where this rule does not apply. Cases where tyrannies manage to survive for a surprisingly long time. The first example he gives is the tyranny of Orthagoras and his sons in Sicyon, which lasted nearly 100 years. He says it lasted long because the rulers were moderate. Second example comes from Corinth. He says where tyranny lasted for 73 years. Rulers were popular, known for living like ordinary citizens, participating in wars, acting like the guardians of their cities, and that's why he said these tyrannies lasted for a long time. They didn't separate themselves from the people, didn't surround themselves even with guards, walked like ordinary citizens. After noting these examples, Aristotle starts criticizing again uh, Plato and Socrates. In my records, it is the second time that he does this. I think the first time he does this in the book 2, if I remember correctly, yeah, where he was criticizing the Republic. But now here, he starts criticizing Plato. He points out that in Plato's Republic, Socrates never really discusses uh, how different regimes can be preserved or destroyed. Socrates, he says, simply assumes that no constitution lasts forever, that all systems pass through a natural cycle of rise, decay, and transformation. That's all about the book 5. We conclude the book 5 here, and there are 3 more books remaining, book 6, book 7, book 8. In the coming weeks, you will see me also exploring them as well. Thanks for listening. If you enjoy these episodes, make sure to like and subscribe on YouTube. Follow and leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You can also find this show on all other major podcast platforms or apps. And for daily content, follow me on Instagram at philosophy.everyday or send me a message. And if you missed the earlier episodes, go check out them as well, because the concepts and theories that I have covered here builds upon the discussions that we've had in the previous chapters. Alongside these solo episodes, I've got guest conversations coming up too. I've had one recently with Roman Yampolsky on AI and simulation theory, with Massimo Pigliucci on Stoicism, and Stephen Hicks on enlightenment, and very recently, a week ago, Spencer Greenberg on rationality and decision making, and some tips about how to make better decisions, and how to live an orderly, rational life overall. Check them out if you're interested. Okay, until next time, then. Bye.